The dust in the Dakota Territory was a fine red powder that lived in the air, settled on every surface, and worked its way into the soul. It coated the raw lumber of the settlement's only significant structure, a long building that served as a saloon on weekdays and a church on Sundays. Depending on which way the sign was turned, the thin, metallic clang of hammers on steel rang from the east, where the railroad was relentlessly chewing its way west, a promise of fortune for some and ruin for others. Eliza Hart stood by the warped plank wall, feeling the vibrations of a poorly played piano through the soles of her worn boots. To her, the world was a collection of such vibrations, a tapestry of loud rumbles and muffled thuds. The high, sharp notes of conversation were lost to her, casualties of the fever that had swept through her childhood and left her in a world of muted sound. But she was a watcher. She saw the slump of her stepfather's shoulders, the greedy glint in her uncle's eyes as he spoke to the woman in the feathered hat. Her name was Maeve Kincaid. Eliza knew her by the way the men in town watched her, a mix of fear and desire. Eliza focused on their mouths, her one true window into the world of words. Her uncle gestured toward her, his lips forming shapes she knew well. Useless, cannot hear a thing, mute as a stone. It was the same story they had told for years, a convenient excuse that had slowly become her cage. Maeve Kincaid's painted lips curled into a smile that did not reach her eyes. She looked Eliza over, a cool assessment like a rancher judging livestock. Then, the final words, sharp and clear on her stepfather's lips, a betrayal that landed like a physical blow. $60 and the debt is cleared. The world seemed to tilt. The muffled piano, the distant hammering, the low murmur of the saloon, it all faded into a dull roar inside her head. She was a debt, a sum of $60. She clutched the small, smooth object hanging from a leather cord at her ear. A charm carved from fish bone, the last thing her mother had given her, whispering a promise that she would always have a piece of the river, a piece of freedom. Now, that freedom felt like a distant shore. Two men, their blue coats stained with trail dust and sweat, approached her. They were not soldiers, not anymore, but they carried the same brutal efficiency in their movements. One grabbed her arm, his grip hard and impersonal. There was no argument, no farewell. Her stepfather and uncle turned their backs, their debt paid, their burden cast off. Eliza was led out into the punishing sunlight, the red dust swirling around her ankles as she was half pulled, half pushed toward a waiting wagon. A hawk circled high above, a dark speck against the immense, indifferent blue sky. She watched it until her neck ached, memorizing its effortless glide. The journey was a jarring torment of rutted tracks and the mean silence of her captors. They spoke to each other in low tones, but Eliza did not bother to watch their lips. Their meaning was clear enough in the rough way they handled her, in the leering glances that made her skin crawl. She retreated into herself, her world shrinking to the jolting of the wagon and the feel of the fishbone charm against her cheek. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, began to curdle in the west. Dark gray clouds boiled up over the horizon, and the air grew heavy and still. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, striking the canvas cover of the wagon with loud, percussive pops. Then the sound changed, hardening into a sharp clatter. The rain turned to ice, hailstones, first the size of pebbles and then of acorns, hammered down. A relentless assault from the heavens. The horses screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through Eliza's muted hearing. The driver fought with the reins, his curses swallowed by the roar of the storm. The world outside the wagon was a blur of gray sheets and bouncing ice. Then came a violent lurch, the crack of splintering wood, and a stomach-dropping sensation of falling. Eliza was thrown against the side of the wagon, her head striking something hard before she was tossed out into the chaos. She landed in a muddy ditch, the icy stones pelting her back and shoulders. The overturned wagon lay like a dead beast, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. The horses, tangled in their harnesses, thrashed and kicked, One of the bluecoats was pinned beneath the wagon's frame, screaming. The other was trying to control the panicked animals, slipping and sliding in the mud. Through the curtain of hail, a figure appeared on the side track of the hill. He moved with a quiet purpose, seemingly unbothered by the storm. He was a big man, dressed in buckskins that were dark with rain, his hair long and tied back with a strip of leather. He carried no rifle, only a hatchet at his belt and a large carving knife sheathed at his hip. He went to the horses first, speaking to them in a low, calm voice, his hands gentle but firm as he worked to free them from the wreckage. Once the animals were calmed and clear, he turned his attention to the wagon. He assessed the situation with a quick, practiced eye, then began to lever the heavy frame with a fallen log. The trapped bluecoat, seeing him, stopped screaming and started shouting threats. The man ignored him. His gaze found Eliza, huddled in the ditch. He walked over, his boots sinking into the mud. He knelt, his face level with hers. It was a rugged face, weathered by sun and wind, with kind eyes that seemed to see more than most. He made a simple gesture, a questioning tilt of his head, his hand motioning toward the wagon. "Are you hurt?" Eliza shook her head, pulling her thin shawl tighter. He seemed to understand that she would not speak. He pointed to his ear, then shook his head slightly, a question in his eyes. She hesitated, then gave a small, jerky nod. It was easier than the alternative. He nodded back, a flicker of understanding in his expression. He saw her, but not as a broken thing. He saw her as a person in a storm. With a grunt of effort, he and the other bluecoat finally lifted the wagon enough for the pinned man to drag his injured leg free. He lay in the mud, groaning and cursing. The standing bluecoat, his confidence returning now that the immediate danger had passed, drew his pistol. "Much obliged for the help. Stranger," he said, his voice hard, "now you can be on your way. The girl is our property." The mountain man, Jonah Pike, did not so much as flinch. He slowly wiped his muddy hands on his buckskin trousers. His carving knife, with its handle of worn, polished wood, remained in its sheath, but it seemed to carry more weight than the pistol in the other man's hand. Property. Jonah's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. A labor contract, all legal, signed and paid for. Sheriff Cobb's own seal is on it. From the main road, maybe 30 paces distant, another rider appeared, obscured for a moment by the thinning hail. Sheriff Cobb himself, his badge a dull star on his wet coat. He called out to his man, his voice too far for Eliza to hear clearly, but her eyes, sharp and practiced, found his face. She saw the words form on his lips as if he were standing next to her. "Get the girl and get back to town. Do not cause trouble with Pike." The knowledge was a secret warmth in her chest. They knew this man, and Cobb was wary of him. The bluecoat with the gun wavered. Glancing between Jonah and his boss, "You heard the sheriff," he blustered. "She comes with us." Jonah did not move. He simply looked at the man, his gaze steady and unwavering. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. At that moment, a shot rang out, deafeningly loud. A gout of mud erupted a foot from Jonah's boot. It was a warning. Jonah's posture changed. The quiet helper vanished, replaced by something harder, something forged in a past he kept hidden. "You made 2 mistakes," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "First was calling her property. Second was that shot." From the ridge overlooking the road, another figure watched from the cover of the dense, dripping pines. Tatanka 2 Rivers, known as Tatanka, saw it all. He saw the overturned wagon, the fear in the girl's eyes, and the quiet, deadly stillness of Jonah Pike, a man he knew to be as unmovable as the Black Hills themselves. He had been tracking the wagon, uneasy about its cargo, and now his caution felt justified. Down on the road, the standoff resolved without another shot. The bluecoat, faced with Jonah's unyielding presence and the memory of his sheriff's warning, slowly lowered his pistol, He and his partner, who was now hobbling, knew they were outmatched. They were bullies, not fighters. And Jonah Pike was a fighter. They collected their horses, leaving the ruined wagon where it lay. Ashford will hear about this. "Pike," the uninjured one spat, "this is not over." They rode off, leaving a profound silence broken only by the dripping of water from the trees and the distant roll of thunder. The scent of wet pine and damp earth filled the air. Jonah turned back to Eliza. The hardness left his face, replaced again by that quiet concern. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the shame that warred with her fear. He crouched down again so she could see his face. "See his lips. My cabin is not far. It is safe there." He paused, letting the words sink in. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the fear of trading one cage for another. He added, his voice firm but gentle, a promise carved in the air between them. "No one will touch you if you do not allow it." Eliza searched his face, looking for the lie. The trick. She found none. She saw only a sincerity as solid and real as the granite hills around them. For the first time since her world had been sold for $60, a fragile sliver of hope pushed through her despair. She gave a single, slow nod, as Jonah helped her to her feet and led her away from the wreckage, up the slick path toward the shelter of the trees. Tatanka watched them go. His sharp eyes were drawn to the small charm at the girl's ear. It was not the carved bone that held his gaze, but the thin, braided leather cord it hung from. The pattern was intricate, a series of knots and dyed threads forming a design he knew as well as his own name. It was a Lakota pattern, one his own mother had woven, a pattern she had worn the last time he saw her, years ago, when her path crossed that of a desperate family heading into these very hills. He pulled the hood of his cloak lower, melting back into the shadows of the pines, a new, urgent purpose settling in his heart. The girl with the silent tongue and the listening eyes was tied to this land, and to his past, in a way she could not possibly know. The cabin was more of a promise than a shelter. 3 walls stood solid, built of pine logs Jonah had felled and notched himself. The gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and moss. The air inside smelled of fresh-cut wood smoke, and the clean, sharp scent of the mountains. The 4th wall, however, was a heavy canvas tarp, stretched taut and lashed to the frame. It was a testament to a life interrupted, a project not yet finished. It billowed in the breeze, a constant, soft drumming that reminded them both of how thin the barrier was between their small circle of firelight and the vast, wild darkness outside. In the days that followed the storm, a quiet routine took root in that unfinished space. Language, for Eliza, had always been a one-way street of observation. Now, it became a shared creation. Jonah, a man accustomed to the solitude of the high country, found himself becoming a student. He would point to the water bucket, and Eliza would watch his mouth as he said the word, water. Then she would show him the sign, a cupped hand brought to the lips. He was a clumsy student at first, his large, calloused hands struggling with the simple gestures. But he was patient. He learned food, a gesture of putting something in the mouth, fire, fingers fluttering upwards like flames, danger, a sharp, slicing motion across the throat. In return, she taught him to be seen. He learned to face her when he spoke, to keep his hands away from his mouth. To speak slowly, he began to see the world as she did, a place of expressions, postures, and the subtle dance of lips forming silent words. He found a strange intimacy in it, a connection deeper than any he had known through speech alone. One evening, as he was carving a piece of birchwood, he looked up and saw her watching him, a small, tentative smile on her face. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced him, the memory of another smile, another woman, lost to the same kind of brutal trade that had ensnared Eliza. His hand stilled, the knife digging too deep into the wood. He set it down, the ghost of that old pain making the small cabin feel cold and empty. Eliza saw the change in him. She saw the shadow pass over his eyes, the sudden tension in his jaw. She wanted to ask, to understand, But their new language was not yet built for such things. It could not carry the weight of memory or grief. Instead, she rose and added a log to the fire, a simple, practical act that was its own kind of comfort. She would not be a burden. She mended the tear in his buckskin shirt with thread she had salvaged from the lining of her own dress. She swept the dirt floor with a broom made of twigs. She found her place in the rhythm of the cabin, proving, mostly to herself, that she was more than the $60 for which she had been sold. A week after the hailstorm, a visitor came. He did not knock or call out. He simply appeared at the edge of the clearing, a tall, lean figure who moved with the silence of a hunting cat. It was the Lakota man from the ridge. Jonah saw him first and stood, his hand resting near the hatchet at his belt, not in aggression, but in readiness. The man raised an open palm in a sign of peace. He walked into the firelight, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at the half-finished wall, at the neatly stacked firewood, and at Eliza, who stood near the hearth. His gaze lingered for a moment on the leather cord at her ear. "I am Tatanka," he said, his voice quiet. He looked at Jonah. "I need salt." Jonah studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod toward the small sack inside the cabin. Tatanka followed him in. Eliza watched from the doorway, her senses on high alert. This was not a simple visit. She could see it in the way the two men stood, in the low, serious tones of their voices. She moved closer, staying in the shadows, her eyes fixed on their faces. "Ashford is throwing a party at the saloon," Tatanka said, his back to her, celebrating the new rail spur. Jonah measured out a small amount of salt into a piece of cloth. "That is not my concern." Tatanka took the salt, but did not leave. He will be bringing in new workers for the line, and new girls for Maeve Kincaid. The contracts are already written. More debts to be paid. The words hung in the air. Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. More girls like her. Jonah's face was grim. He looked past Tatanka, his eyes finding Eliza's. He saw that she had understood. Tatanka gave a slow nod, his gaze flicking to Eliza and then back to Jonah. "The man with the blue coat. The one who shot at you. He works for Ashford now. They are looking for the girl, and for you." He turned and left as silently as he had come, melting back into the trees. The silence he left behind was heavy. Jonah went outside and scanned the dark line of the forest. The night felt different now, filled with unseen watchers. Eliza came to stand beside him. She touched his arm, and when he looked down, she made the sign for danger. He nodded, his jaw tight. He understood. The world was coming for them. The next afternoon, he found the message. It was not on the door, but on a tall pine that marked the entrance to the path leading to his cabin. A crude handprint, black and greasy, smeared onto the bark with charcoal from a dead fire. It was a threat, a violation. It said, "We know where you are." He stripped the bark from the tree with his knife, methodically erasing the mark, but he could not erase the knowledge of it. The ashes fell to the ground, a dark stain on the pine needles, a reminder of the ugliness that was hunting them. That night, the wind rose. It came down from the high peaks, a low moan that grew into a ravenous howl. It tore at the canvas wall, making the tarp snap and crack like a whip. The small fire in the hearth cast dancing, monstrous shadows that writhed and leaped. Eliza and Jonah sat in the strained silence, listening to the fury of the storm. She felt a familiar knot of panic in her stomach, the feeling of being trapped and powerless. She looked at Jonah, and he gave her a reassuring look, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. Then came a sound louder than the wind, a violent tearing sound. One of the ropes holding the tarp gave way. The canvas ripped free from its moorings, flying inwards, bringing a blast of cold, wet air and exposing their small shelter to the night. For a heart-stopping second, the firelight blazed out into the darkness, a beacon in the storm. Jonah moved instantly, kicking dirt and ash over the flames, plunging the cabin into near total blackness. He grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her down behind the log wall. They waited, their breath held, listening. The wind howled, but beneath it, there were other sounds. The crunch of a boot on a loose stone, a low, muttered curse. They were out there. The fire had shown them the way. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, clear and sharp, the hoot of a great horned owl. It came once, then twice. It was not a real owl. It was a signal. Jonah's grip on her arm tightened. He put a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the back of the cabin, to a space beneath a thick tangle of ancient pine roots that grew through the floor. He had shown it to her once. A narrow escape tunnel he had dug, leading out to a hollow on the other side of the small hill. He went first, pushing aside the loose boards that covered it. Eliza scrambled after him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The tunnel was tight and dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and roots. They emerged into the relative quiet of a small ravine, the wind shielded by the trees. Tatanka was there, a shadow among shadows. He put a hand on Jonah's shoulder and pointed back the way they had come. 3 of them, he mouthed in the dark. Jonah nodded. He looked at Eliza, his face a pale oval in the gloom. He made a gesture, a circle in the air with his finger, then pointed in the opposite direction. Circle back. He, Tatanka, and Eliza moved as one, their feet making no sound on the soft, wet ground. They did not run, they flowed through the woods, using the storm as cover. They crossed their own path twice, laying a false trail that led down toward the creek, before climbing into the high rocks to watch. From their perch, they saw the flicker of lanterns below. The 3 bluecoats, frustrated and angry, casting about in the dark. They followed the false trail for a time, their lights growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the forest. For a long while, no one moved. The wind began to die down, its fury spent. The forest dripped around them. Finally, Jonah broke the silence. He looked from Tatanka to Eliza. "Hiding will not work," he said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "They will not stop." Tatanka agreed with a slow nod. "Maeve Kincaid holds the leash, and Ashford holds hers." Eliza listened, her mind racing. They were pieces on a board, being moved and hunted, but they were not helpless. She had seen things in the saloon, heard whispers. She knew the power of being underestimated. She looked at Jonah and made a series of signs. Some he had taught her, some she invented on the spot. She pointed toward the town. She made the sign for Maeve Kincaid, a flutter of fingers to mimic a feathered hat. Then she made a gesture like opening a book of names, a book of debts, a book of lives bought and sold. Jonah watched her hands, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning understanding. He looked at Tatanka, who had also understood. "Evidence," Jonah said, the words seeming to solidify in the cold night air. "We need the proof." Tatanka's eyes were dark and serious. "It is in the snake's den. To get it means walking straight into her parlor." Jonah looked back at Eliza. Her face was set, her fear pushed down by a new, hard resolve. She met his gaze without flinching. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, and she was ready to fight. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Then we go into the snake's den." The town was a different creature by night, swollen and feverish with the promise of Ashford's money. Lanterns hung from every post, casting a garish yellow light that turned the red dust to a muddy orange. The sound was a physical force, a low beastly roar composed of laughter, shouting, and the relentless banging of a piano. It pressed in on Eliza, a chaotic surf of vibrations that made the bones in her skull ache. Sheriff Cobb's men were everywhere, their blue coats and shiny badges meant to project order, but they only added to the sense of a town held captive. They had arrived separately. Tatanka had come in with the last of the freight wagons, his posture slumped, his hat low. easily melting into the crowd of laborers and drifters looking for a day's work holding horses. Jonah had entered through the back alley. Reeking of cheap whiskey, he had poured on his coat, but not swallowed, stumbling just enough to appear harmless. A carpenter down on his luck looking for a free drink. Eliza had slipped in through the kitchen, a thin, gray dress replacing her trail clothes, her hair tucked under a drab bonnet. She carried a stack of clean rags and kept her eyes downcast, making herself small, invisible. Her supposed deafness was her shield and her weapon. In a world that equated silence with stupidity, she was beneath notice. People did not guard their words around the furniture, and tonight she was furniture that could walk. Inside the grand saloon, the heat and noise were overwhelming. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, perfume, stale beer, and roasting meat. Men in fine suits stood shoulder to shoulder with dusty prospectors, all of them orbiting Colonel Edwin Ashford, a man whose smile was as polished and hard as the gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat. Eliza began to work, collecting empty glasses from tables, her movements deliberately slow and a little clumsy. She let her gaze drift, never settling too long on any one person. But she saw everything. She saw Jonah leaning against the far wall, his eyes seemingly unfocused. But she knew he was watching the room, tracking the guards, noting the exits. She saw the long, ornate mirror that ran the length of the bar, a grand thing shipped all the way from the east, in its rippling, imperfect glass. She saw 100 reflections. She saw herself, a gray ghost moving through a party. She saw Jonah, a hulking shadow pretending to be drunk. She saw Ashford, the smiling predator at the center of his web. The mirror showed them all their parts, the masks they wore for the world. She was clearing a table near the back when the wave of sound crested. A roar of laughter, sharp and sudden, followed by the shattering of a glass. The vibrations shot up through the floorboards. A violent, painful jolt. The world swam. The faces around her blurred into grotesque masks of open-mouthed sound. She felt her breath catch, her chest tighten. It was too much. The noise was a physical assault, breaking through her defenses. She stumbled, and a hand steadied her arm. It was Jonah. He had moved through the crowd as if it were water. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "Are you all right?" His lips formed the words slowly, a lifeline in the chaos. Eliza reached out her free hand, the one hidden from the room by his body, and tapped the back of his hand twice, the signal they had agreed upon. "I am fine." He gave a barely perceptible nod and released her, melting back toward the wall. The moment of connection, small and secret, was enough. It was an anchor. She took a slow, deep breath and continued her work. Her focus narrowed, her resolve hardened. She made her way near the small, private alcove where Ashford was holding court with Sheriff Cobb. She knelt to wipe up a spill, her back to them. An anonymous servant. Their voices were low, but she was not listening with her ears. She watched their reflections in the polished surface of a silver tray on a nearby table. Ashford leaned in close to the sheriff, his expression serious. "The night train," he said, his lips barely moving. "Through Stone Pass. Make sure the track is clear." Cobb nodded, his jowls quivering. "It will be. How many?" "6, Ashford murmured, taking a sip from his glass. "A fresh shipment. The investors expect a good return." 6 girls. The word struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. 6 more lives to be fed into this machine. She felt a cold fury rise within her, a feeling so pure and sharp it cut through her fear. She had to get that book. Her chance came when Maeve Kincaid swept through the room, drawing Ashford and his cronies out onto the main floor to make a grand announcement. In the flurry of movement, the small office behind the bar was left momentarily unattended. It was now or never. Eliza piled her tray high with dirty glasses and walked toward the back, her path taking her right past the office door. With a quick glance to ensure no one was watching, she slipped inside, closing the door almost all the way behind her. The room was small and cluttered, smelling of cigar smoke and spilled ink. And there, against the far wall, was the safe. It was a block of black iron, squat and menacing. A small brass key was in the lock. They had not even bothered to remove it. It was the combination that mattered. Eliza set her tray down. Her mind, so often a quiet refuge, was now a whirlwind of panic and purpose. She had to be fast. She looked at the dial, at the numbers etched into the steel. She could not write them down. She had to remember. She began to translate the numbers into the hand signs Jonah had taught her, a language of the body that was more permanent than ink on paper. 4. A hand held flat, thumb tucked. 15. A fist with a thumb extended. Then a hand with 5 fingers spread wide. 26. Her fingers flew, weaving the combination into the muscle memory of her hands, a secret code no one else could read. She reached for the key, her fingers brushing the cold brass. When the door creaked open behind her, Eliza froze, her back to the door, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "Well now," said a voice, low and laced with a dangerous amusement. "What do we have here?" It was Maeve Kincaid. Eliza did not turn. To turn would be to reveal the panic on her face. To turn would be to admit she had heard. She forced herself to stay still for a second longer, a deaf girl lost in her own silent world. Then she slowly straightened up, as if sensing a presence behind her. She turned, her eyes wide and blank, her expression one of mild confusion. Maeve stood in the doorway, one hand on her hip, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over Eliza, taking in the drab dress, the tray of dirty glasses, and the way Eliza stood before the safe. She saw something in Eliza's eyes then, a flicker of intelligence, a depth that did not belong in the face of the dull, witless creature she had purchased. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Eliza knew that in this moment, her life depended on her performance. She let her mouth fall slightly open, adopting the vacant look she had been forced to wear for years. She raised her hands and made a series of clumsy, jerky gestures. She pointed at the glasses, then at her own chest, then made a sweeping motion toward the door. "I was just clearing the glasses." Her signs were intentionally crude, the language of someone who had never been properly taught, someone isolated and alone. She let a look of fear cross her face, the fear of a servant caught where she should not be. Maeve watched the clumsy pantomime, her suspicion warring with her own prejudice. She saw a frightened, simple-minded girl. The spark she thought she had seen in her eyes must have been a trick of the light. Her smile returned, full of condescending pity. "A lost little lamb?" she murmured, more to herself than to Eliza. She waved a dismissive hand. "Go on, get out. The work is not finished out there." Eliza bobbed her head in a grateful, witless way. As she bent to pick up the tray, her hand, shielded by her body, closed around the small brass key. In one fluid motion, she slid it from the lock and into the folds of a large handkerchief tucked in her sleeve. She grabbed the tray and scurried past Maeve, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not stop until she was outside in the cool night air of the alley. She leaned against the rough plank wall, her legs trembling, and drew in a ragged breath. She had done it, inside her sleeve. She felt the hard outline of the key, and the memorized pattern of the combination was seared into her mind. A few minutes later, Jonah found her there. He said nothing, simply stood beside her, his presence a solid and reassuring weight in the darkness. She looked up at him, the noise of the party a distant rumble now. She showed him the key in the palm of her hand. His eyes widened slightly, a look of profound respect dawning on his face. He had expected her to be a scout, a pair of eyes. He had not expected this. He looked down at the young woman before him, at the quiet strength in her face, the fierce intelligence that she had kept hidden from the world for so long. All the words her family had used to describe her, useless, broken, mute. They were all lies. He saw the truth. "You are not useless," Jonah said, his voice low and certain. The words meant only for her. He spoke slowly, clearly, so she could not mistake his meaning. "You are as sharp as a newly honed blade." The moon was high and cold, a silver coin in a black sky, when they moved. The party had guttered out, leaving behind only the most determined drinkers and the deep, exhausted silence of a town that had celebrated too hard. The back alley of the saloon was a river of shadows, smelling of sour beer and regret. Tatanka was a ghost, already positioned on the roof of the adjacent livery stable, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the street and the alley below. Jonah and Eliza slipped through the darkness, their feet making no sound on the packed earth. The office window was as they had hoped, left slightly ajar to vent the stale cigar smoke. Jonah worked his carving knife into the slim gap, gently prying the latch. The wood gave a soft groan of protest, a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. They froze, listening. Nothing but the distant, lonely howl of a coyote. Jonah slid the window open, and in a single, fluid motion, he was through. He turned and helped Eliza over the sill, his hands strong and steady on hers. Inside, the room was a black cube, but as their eyes adjusted, the moonlight streaming through the window painted a pale rectangle on the floor and glinted off the brass dial of the safe. The air was thick with the ghost of Maeve Kincaid's perfume. Jonah moved to the safe, every sense on high alert. He took the small brass key from Eliza. It felt cold in his palm. He slid it into the lock and turned it. The click was tiny, but it echoed in the confined space. Now the real work began. He knelt, his ear close to the iron door, his large fingers resting on the dial. He looked to Eliza. She stood beside him, her face a pale mask in the gloom. She raised her left hand, holding it steady in a sliver of moonlight. She held up 4 fingers, her thumb tucked in. Jonah's hand moved, the dial turning with a soft, whirring sound. He stopped when he felt the first subtle shift in the mechanism. He nodded. Eliza's hand changed, a fist with the thumb out, then a hand with 5 fingers spread. 15, again. He turned the dial in the opposite direction, slowly, feeling for the faint tremor as the second tumbler fell. His focus was absolute. He could feel the intricate workings of the lock through the tips of his fingers, a language of metal and gravity. Eliza made the final signs. A 2, then a 6, 26. He made the last turn. A solid, satisfying clunk echoed from within the safe. With extreme care, Jonah pulled the heavy iron door open. The air that escaped was stale and dry. Inside, sitting on the top shelf, was a large, leather-bound ledger. Below it was a small wooden box. Jonah lifted the ledger out first, its weight feeling significant, heavy with the secrets it held. He handed it to Eliza. Then he reached for the box. As Eliza opened the book, Jonah struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with his cupped hands. The light flickered over the page. It was filled with neat, precise handwriting. Names, a long column of names, mostly women. Beside each name was a place of origin, an age, and a dollar amount. At the top of the page were the words, Labor and Entertainment Contracts, Property of M. Kincaid. It was a ledger of human lives, bought and sold as chattel. Eliza's eyes scanned the names, her breath catching in her throat. She saw a destination listed for a group of them. Night Train, Stone Pass, the 6 girls Ashford had spoken of. Jonah opened the small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a small, sad collection of objects. A mother-of-pearl button, a faded blue ribbon, tied into a bow, a small, carved wooden bird, a single silver earring. These were not inventory, they were mementos, pieces of the people who had passed through this place, their identities stripped away until only these small tokens remained. Tatanka, watching from the roof across the alley, saw it before they did. A single lantern, moving steadily up the street. It was too late for a casual stroller. He gave a low whistle, the sound of a nightjar, a signal of imminent danger. Inside the office, they heard it. Jonah immediately smothered the match. He took the ledger from Eliza and tucked it securely inside his coat. Eliza's hand darted into the wooden box, her fingers closing around the faded blue ribbon before Jonah shut the lid and shoved it back into the safe. There was no time to close the door. A key rattled in the back door lock. A heavy boot scraped on the threshold. They were trapped. The only way out was the window. Jonah scrambled through, then turned to help Eliza. As she climbed onto the sill, the office door swung open, and a man in a blue coat stood silhouetted against the light from the saloon. "Stop right there," he yelled, his hand going for his gun. They did not hesitate. Jonah half threw, half lowered Eliza onto the low, sloping roof below the window. He followed a second later, his boots thudding on the corrugated tin. The sound was a clap of thunder in the night. The blue coat fired, the shot screaming past Jonah's head and punching a hole in the night sky. They ran. Their feet slipped on the slick metal, the whole roof groaning and popping under their weight. It was like running on a drum, announcing their every move to the sleeping town. Lights began to appear in windows. Shouts echoed from the street below. Another shot rang out, this one from a different angle. A second blue coat, a sharpshooter, was on the roof of the saloon itself, kneeling to take careful aim. Jonah grabbed Eliza, pulling her down behind a brick chimney. The bullet sparked off the bricks where her head had been moments before. They were pinned. From the livery stable roof, Tatanka moved. He was a silent blur of motion. He drew his bow, knocking an arrow with practiced speed. He was not aiming for the man. He was aiming for the threat. He drew the string back to his cheek, his breath a white plume in the cold air, and he let the arrow fly. It whispered through the night, a deadly sigh. The sharpshooter on the saloon roof screamed. A high, sharp sound of pain and surprise. The arrow had gone straight through the wooden stock of his rifle, pinning the weapon and the hand that held it to the shingles of the roof. His gun was useless, and he was not going anywhere. The diversion was all they needed. Jonah looked over the edge of the roof. Below them was the alley, and a large, stinking pile of trash and wet straw from the stables. It was a 10-foot drop. He looked at Eliza. There is no other way. He did not wait for an answer. He clutched the ledger to his chest with one arm, grabbed her hand with the other, and leaped. They fell through the darkness together, landing with a jarring, foul-smelling impact in the heap of refuse. For a moment they lay there, the wind knocked out of them, the shouts and chaos from the rooftops seeming to come from another world. They scrambled out of the trash, bruised and stinking, but alive. And with the book, the town was coming alive now. Doors banging open, men pouring into the street. They could hear Sheriff Cobb's voice bellowing orders. They had to disappear. They slipped from one shadow to the next, making their way toward the edge of town. Behind them, they heard a man nailing something to the saloon door. A little while later, a drunk they passed in an alleyway was muttering to himself. $100. $100 for the big man and the deaf girl. The word was already out. They were no longer just runaways. They were fugitives with a price on their heads. They found refuge in a dilapidated lean-to behind the blacksmith's shop, the air tasting of cold iron and coal smoke. They were trapped. The town was roused, and the open country was a death sentence with trackers surely on their trail by now. Jonah was checking the precious ledger for damage when a shadow fell over the entrance of the lean-to. He moved instantly, pulling Eliza behind him and drawing his large carving knife. A woman stood there. She was older, her face etched with exhaustion, her hands red and chapped. It was one of the waitresses from the saloon, a woman named Rose. She held up her hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She did not speak. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Eliza. She pointed west, toward the dark mass of the hills, Black Rock Canyon. She whispered, her voice barely audible. "There is an old mining tunnel. It goes through the ridge. Eliza stared at her, her heart pounding. Why? Why would this woman risk everything to help them? Rose seemed to understand the unspoken question. Her eyes glistened in the faint light. She looked at Eliza, and for a moment, her tired face was filled with a profound and terrible sorrow. She brought a hand to her chest and made a simple, fluttering gesture over her heart, a sign for sister. Eliza's breath hitched. She understood. This woman had lost someone, too. Eliza raised her own hand, her fingers stiff with cold, and clumsily formed the sign for thank you. Rose's eyes widened in surprise. Then, a small, sad smile touched her lips. She answered with a sign of her own, a gesture Eliza had never seen but whose meaning was as clear as spring water. 2 hands, held out as if shielding a small flame. Safety. The woman turned and vanished back into the shadows, leaving behind a fragile, unexpected glimmer of hope in the cold, desperate night. The journey to Black Rock Canyon was a desperate flight through a landscape of bone-white rock and skeletal pines, all of it bleached under the indifferent gaze of the moon. Tatanka had found them in the blacksmith's lean-to, appearing as silently as a wisp of smoke, and led them out of the town through a network of gullies and creek beds that only he knew. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through Eliza. The $100 bounty felt like a physical weight on her back, a target painted for every opportunistic scoundrel in the territory. They reached the mouth of the canyon as the first hint of gray dawn softened the eastern sky. It was a jagged wound in the earth, a place of deep shadows and cold, still air. The entrance to the old mine was a dark, menacing maw, partially collapsed and shored up with rotting timbers. A stream of water, black and frigid, flowed from its throat, pooling around a formidable barrier of ice that choked the passageway. The spring thaw had sent a torrent of meltwater down into the earth, which had then refrozen in the perpetual dark, creating a solid, glittering wall. Hope, which had been a small, fragile flame, seemed to flicker and die. They were trapped between the bounty hunters behind and the unmovable mountain ahead. Jonah struck the ice with the heel of his boot. The sound was a dull, defeated thud. It was feet thick. "We would need dynamite in a week," he said, his breath pluming in the cold. Tatanka scanned the canyon walls, his face impassive. But Eliza could see the deep concentration in his eyes. He was looking for another way. A path only a mountain goat would dare. Eliza closed her eyes, shutting out the sight of the impassable ice. She forced her mind back to the night before, to the saloon, to the fleeting reflection in the silver tray. She had been focused on the faces of Ashford and Cobb, but her mind, a quiet storehouse of details, had absorbed everything. Behind them, on the wall of the alcove, had been a framed map. It was a surveyor's map of the new railroad spur, a grid of lines and elevations. She had not consciously studied it, but the image was there, burned into her memory. A thin, dotted line, separate from the main track, labeled Air Shaft B, old ventilation for the silver mine. It was located further up the canyon wall. She opened her eyes, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat of excitement. She tugged on Jonah's sleeve. When he looked down, she began to draw in the dirt with a stick. First, she drew the main tunnel and the block of ice. Then, her memory guiding her hand, she sketched the winding path of the new railroad tracks as they curved through the ridge. And then, the crucial detail, a small X high on the canyon wall, with a dotted line connecting it to the main tunnel, bypassing the flood. Jonah and Tatanka watched, their skepticism slowly turning to awe. Jonah looked from the crude drawing to the canyon wall, and then back to Eliza, a new level of respect in his eyes. He understood. It was a long shot, a memory of a reflection, but it was the only shot they had. The climb was treacherous. The rock was loose and slick with frost, offering few handholds. Tatanka went first, finding a path that seemed impossible. a vertical trail of tiny ledges and deep-rooted shrubs. Jonah came next, his strength a constant support for Eliza, his hands always there to steady her, to find her a foothold. The ledger, wrapped in oilcloth and strapped to his back, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. They found the air shaft exactly where her memory had placed it. It was a narrow, vertical fissure, barely wide enough for a man to fit through, covered by a rusted iron grate. The grate was heavy, but the combined strength of Jonah and Tatanka was enough to pry it loose. A blast of cold, damp air, smelling of deep earth and stagnant water, rushed out to meet them. The descent was even more dangerous than the climb. They had only a short length of rope, forcing them to climb down in stages, trusting their lives to the slick, weeping rock walls. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket broken only by the small, sputtering flame of Jonah's lantern. The sound of rushing water grew louder and louder as they descended, a constant, disorienting roar. For Eliza, the sound was a physical presence. It was a liquid thunder that vibrated through the rock, through her bones, making it impossible to hear anything, to read anything from the world around her. She was truly deaf now, adrift in a sea of roaring chaos. Her only connection to the world, to safety, was Jonah's hand. Before they had entered the tunnel, he had taken her hand and squeezed it twice. "Stop," he had mouthed slowly. Then he squeezed it 3 times. "Go." It was their new language, a simple, desperate code of touch. They reached the floor of the main tunnel. The water was knee-deep and bone-chillingly cold, a fast-moving current that threatened to pull their feet out from under them. They moved slowly, a single, struggling organism against the power of the flood. Jonah went first, the lantern held high, his other hand holding fast to Eliza's. Tatanka brought up the rear, a silent, watchful guardian. 2 squeezes. Eliza froze, her feet numb, her sodden dress dragging in the current. Jonah had stopped, his body tense. He held the lantern still, his head cocked. The beam cut a weak yellow path through the oppressive darkness. Ahead, the tunnel widened, and the rock walls were replaced by massive, timber support beams, crisscrossing into the darkness above them. A strange, rhythmic clanking sound reached them, and a faint, unnatural light flickered in the distance. 3 squeezes. They moved forward, pressing themselves against the rough wall of the tunnel. The clanking grew louder, and the light grew brighter. They rounded a bend and saw it, a steam locomotive, sitting idle on a set of tracks that ran through the heart of the mountain. It was the night train, a work crew, their face pale and ghostly in the lantern light, was making a last-minute repair. There was nowhere to hide. The tunnel was a straight shot, with the train and its crew blocking the way. To go back was impossible. To go forward was to be seen. Jonah's eyes scanned the darkness above, the support beams. He pointed up. Eliza's heart sank. The beams were thick with soot and grease, and they were 20 feet over the tracks. There was no choice. Tatanka, moving with an unnerving, spidery grace, went first, finding holds in the rock and timber. Jonah boosted Eliza up, his powerful arms lifting her until her hands could find a purchase on a thick, cross-hatched beam. He followed, the ledger still on his back. They lay flat on the cold, greasy wood, their hearts pounding, as the work crew below finished their task. Suddenly, with a deafening hiss that shook the very rock around them, the locomotive vented a massive cloud of steam. The hot, wet cloud enveloped them, blinding them, scalding them. Eliza pressed her face against the rough wood, her world a terrifying cacophony of hissing steam and the violent shaking of the beam. She felt Jonah's hand find hers in the chaos, his grip a solid anchor. As the steam cleared, the locomotive gave a lurch, its massive wheels beginning to turn. It moved slowly at first, then gathered speed, its pistons pumping, its single headlight cutting a bright, terrifying path down the tunnel. It passed directly beneath them, so close they could feel the heat from its smokestack. Then it was gone, its clattering fading into the distance, leaving behind an ringing silence and the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. They climbed down, their bodies trembling with cold and reaction. They were soaked and filthy, but they were past the danger. They pressed on, the roar of the floodwater seeming almost peaceful now in comparison. It was Tatanka who found the sign, a small, dark shape huddled in a side passage, a storage area for coal. He held up a hand, and Jonah gave Eliza 2 squeezes. Tatanka approached cautiously. 2 figures were huddled together in the coal bin, their faces and clothes black with dust. They were girls, not much younger than Eliza. One of them looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She held a heavy iron pry bar in her hands, ready to fight. The other girl lay on the floor, her breathing shallow, her body limp. Eliza moved forward slowly, her hands held out, palms open. She knew that words would only frighten them more. She looked at the terrified girl, and she saw her own fear reflected back at her. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small, faded blue ribbon she had taken from the safe. She held it out. It was not a weapon. It was a question and a statement. "I am like you." The girl's eyes flickered from Eliza's face to the ribbon. The tension in her body seemed to lessen by a fraction. She slowly lowered the iron bar. The other girl was barely conscious, her skin cold to the touch. Tatanka did not hesitate. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was as light as a child. As he straightened, a single, perfect eagle feather, which he had tucked into his hair, came loose and drifted down, landing silently on the black coal dust. He looked at it for a moment, then left it where it lay. A sign, a message for those who would come looking. The journey back to the cabin was a slow, grueling nightmare. They took turns carrying the sick girl, while the other leaned heavily on Jonah. When they finally stumbled into the small clearing, the unfinished cabin looked like a palace. Help came in the form of Ludi Graves, the local nurse, summoned by a prearranged signal from Tatanka. She was a woman who looked as though she had been carved from the tough, gnarled wood of a desert juniper, her face a roadmap of hard years. She bustled in, her movements sharp and efficient, clucking her tongue at the state of them all. But her hands were surprisingly gentle as she cleaned and bandaged their wounds and forced a hot, bitter herbal tea down their throats. Later, as the 2 rescued girls slept soundly in Jonah's bunk, another visitor arrived. He was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate web of wrinkles, his long, white hair in 2 braids. He was Old Bear, a Lakota elder Tatanka held in the highest reverence. He looked at Eliza for a long time, his dark eyes seeming to see right through to her soul. He sat with her by the fire, the others keeping a respectful distance. He did not speak for a long time. Then he began to make signs with his hands, slow, graceful movements that were a language in themselves. Tatanka translated in a low voice. "The white man's world is full of noise," he said. "It deafens the spirit. They think because you do not make noise, you cannot hear. They are the deaf ones." Old Bear then looked directly at Eliza and made a series of 3 signs, his expression serene and powerful. "Hear with the eyes," Tatanka translated. "Speak with the hands." He paused, and the old man made the final, most important sign, a hand placed gently over his own heart. "Live with the heart." The cabin, once a simple refuge, had become a command post in a quiet war. The 2 rescued girls, Sarah and Emily, were healing under Ludi Graves's care, their physical wounds mending faster than the shadows in their eyes. The ledger sat on the rough-hewn table, a silent testament to their victory and a constant reminder of the danger that still surrounded them. They had the proof, but they were prisoners in their own sanctuary. Every path out of the hills was watched. Sheriff Cobb's men, supplemented by Ashford's hired guns, had created a perimeter. To move was to be seen, and to be seen was to be captured or killed. It was a Tatanka who brought the news that offered their only path. A circuit judge was coming to the town of Gulch, some 30 miles south, to handle a backlog of land disputes. It was their one chance to present the ledger to a figure of authority outside of Cobb's control. But Gulch lay on the other side of the blockade. "We cannot fight our way through," Jonas said, his voice a low rumble. "There are too many of them. We need to pass through them without being seen as a threat." Tatanka nodded. A single rider would be stopped. 3 of us would be a war party. They are looking for fugitives, not for settlers. An idea began to form in Jonah's mind. An idea he disliked as soon as it appeared. He looked at Eliza, who was watching their faces, piecing together the conversation. "A man and a woman," he said slowly, his eyes on her. A carpenter and his wife, heading to Gulch to find work. Simple folk. They would draw less attention. The logic was sound, but the implications settled heavily in the small room. For the plan to work, it had to be convincing. They would need a story, a destination, and something to prove their status if they were stopped. A marriage certificate. Jonah explained the idea to Eliza, speaking slowly, giving her time to read his lips, as she understood. A shuttered look came over her face. She turned away from him and stared into the fire, her back rigid. He saw her hands clench into tight fists. She picked up a piece of charcoal and wrote on a smooth piece of bark, "A name has weight." Jonah understood immediately. Her entire life, she had been defined by others, mute, deaf, useless, a piece of property to be sold. Now he was proposing to give her another name, another role, even a false one, without her consent. It was a cage, no matter how well-intentioned. The idea of being called a wife, a possession under the law, was a bitter echo of her past. He felt a pang of his own deep-seated resistance. The word wife was a ghost in his own heart. It brought back the scent of wood smoke and wildflowers, the memory of a laughing face, and the crushing, helpless agony of loss. To speak that word, even in pretense, was to walk through a graveyard of his own making. The bond of marriage, a promise of protection he had failed to keep once before, felt like a sacrilege. He had built his life on solitude, a fortress against the pain of ever losing someone like that again. This plan required him to tear down a stone from that fortress wall. That night, the cabin was filled with a strained silence. Eliza kept to one side of the fire, Jonah to the other. He watched her as she stared into the flames, her face a mask of conflict. He saw not a burden, but a partner. He saw the sharp mind that had memorized the safe's combination from a reflection, the courage that had carried her through the flooded mine. She was not asking for protection. She was fighting for her own life, her own justice. And he was asking her to hide that strength behind a costume of domesticity. He picked up a small, discarded piece of pine from the woodpile. It was a good piece, the grain straight and clear. He took out his carving knife, the one with the worn handle that felt like an extension of his own hand. He began to work, not with any plan, but letting the feel of the wood guide him. The shavings fell in soft, fragrant curls onto the floor. He was not trying to make something beautiful or ornate. He was simply shaping the wood, his hands moving in a familiar, comforting rhythm. He worked for hours, the only sound in the cabin the soft scrape of his blade and the crackle of the fire. He carved a simple, smooth band, perfectly round. He sanded it with a piece of rough stone until it was silky to the touch. The grain of the pine flowed around the ring in concentric circles, like the ripples in a pond, like the years of a tree's life. It was a record of growth, of time, of quiet endurance. The next morning, he approached her as she was drawing water from the creek. The air was cold and crisp, and the rising sun cast long shadows through the pines. He stood before her, not speaking, and held out his hand. Lying in his calloused palm was the wooden ring. It was not a demand, it was an offering. Eliza looked from the ring to his face. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the ghosts he was fighting. She understood that this was as hard for him as it was for her. This was not about ownership. It was about survival, a partnership. She slowly reached out and took the ring. It was warm from his hand, and impossibly light. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The journey to Gulch was a quiet, tense affair. They traveled in a small, rickety wagon Jonah had borrowed, loaded with his carpentry tools to complete the illusion. Tatanka shadowed them from the hills, a silent, unseen protector. As they neared the town, they saw the increased patrols, riders in blue coats who watched them with cold, suspicious eyes. But the sight of a simple workman with his wife, the woman's head demurely covered by a bonnet, seemed to satisfy them. They were waved through 2 checkpoints without incident. Gulch was a smaller, dustier version of the settlement they had fled. It had 1 main street, a few dozen buildings, and a small, whitewashed chapel with a crooked steeple. The preacher was a thin, stooped man with watery eyes who seemed relieved to have any business at all. He mumbled his way through the legal necessities, his voice droning in the empty chapel. Jonah paid him with $2 silver, and the man asked no questions. He pushed a printed certificate and a pen across the worn wooden table. Jonah signed his name. Then he slid the paper to Eliza. She picked up the pen, the nib scratching on the cheap paper as she wrote her own name. Eliza Hart. For a moment, she stared at it. The last time her name had been on a piece of paper, it had been a bill of sale. The preacher cleared his throat. "It is customary to say the vows now," he said a little uncertainly. Jonah turned to Eliza. The air in the small, dusty room was thick with unspoken words. The preacher, the law, the world outside, all expected one thing. But Jonah knew that the words of this world meant nothing here, in the space between the 2 of them. He raised his hands, ignoring the preacher's confused stare. His movements were slow, deliberate. A silent conversation meant only for her. He made the sign for freedom, then the sign for together. Then he simply held his hands out, palms up. A question. Do you agree to be free? Together. It was not the question the law required. It was the question her heart required. It was not a vow of ownership, but a pledge of alliance. He was not naming her his wife. He was asking her to be his partner. A slow, genuine smile spread across Eliza's face, a radiant warmth that seemed to push back the shadows and the dust, the weight on her chest, the fear of being caged by another name. Simply dissolved. She nodded, a single, clear movement. Yes. For the benefit of the preacher, Jonah gave a curt nod. She agrees. He said they were pronounced man and wife. They walked out of the chapel and into the harsh sunlight. A legal document clutched in Eliza's hand. The paper was a lie. The wooden ring was a lie. But the vow they had made in the silent language of their own making was the truest thing either of them had ever known. As they harnessed their horse to the wagon, a man lounging in the shade of the assayer's office across the street watched them. He was a wiry man with a shifty gaze. He saw Jonah, and a flicker of recognition and greed lit up his eyes. He waited until the wagon was creaking its way down the main street. Then he pushed himself off the wall and hurried toward the telegraph office. They made it through the final checkpoint on the road out of Gulch. The guard, a young man with a bored expression, glanced at the marriage certificate, his eyes lingering for a moment on the simple wooden ring on Eliza's hand. He waved them on. They were through. The first part of their plan had worked. That night, they made a cold camp in a rocky ravine miles from the road. As they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Tatanka emerged from the darkness. His face was grim. "The man in Gulch," he said to Jonah. "He sent a wire. Cobb knows you passed through. He knows about the certificate." A cold dread settled in Eliza's stomach. Their shield had also become a beacon. But Tatanka had more news, gleaned from a conversation he had overheard between 2 of Ashford's men. "The ledger you carry," he said, pointing to the oilcloth-wrapped bundle. "It is the travel ledger. It lists the girls, the destinations, but it is not the main book. Maeve Kincaid keeps another one. A master ledger. It holds everything. The names of the silent partners, the officials who have been paid, the entire map of their operation. The realization dawned on them with crushing weight. The book they had risked everything for was only a chapter, the real story, the proof that could bring down not just Cobb, but Ashford and the entire corrupt system was still in the one place they had hoped never to see again. They had to go back to the town, back to the saloon, back to the snake's den. The journey back to the cabin was a retreat into a state of siege. They moved under the cover of darkness, taking a long, circuitous route through the high country. Every shadow a potential enemy, every gust of wind carrying a potential warning. The knowledge of Maeve Kincaid's second ledger lay between them. A cold, hard fact. They had won a battle, but the heart of the enemy's fortress remained untouched. The simple pine cabin, which had once felt like a haven, now felt like a trap they were setting for themselves. They spent the next few days in a state of tense preparation. Tatanka was a phantom in the woods, constantly circling, watching the approaches. His presence a silent assurance that they were not entirely blind. Jonah, his hands never idle, began to finish the fourth wall. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, cutting and notching the final logs, fitting them into place. It was a practical necessity against the coming winter, but it was more than that. It was an act of defiance, a statement that this small piece of the world was theirs, a place they would make whole and defend. Eliza worked alongside him, chinking the gaps with moss and mud, her movements economical and precise. They moved around each other in a quiet, practiced rhythm, a partnership forged in crisis that now felt as natural as breathing. The first snow came not as a storm, but as a quiet apology from a gray, overcast sky. Soft, fat flakes drifted down, clinging to the needles of the pines and slowly, gently, erasing the hard edges of the world. It muffled the sounds of the forest, creating a profound and beautiful silence. For a day, it felt like a reprieve, a clean white blanket tucking them in, hiding them from the world. But by the second night, the gentle snowfall had become a blizzard. The wind rose, a low, mournful howl that drove the snow horizontally in blinding sheets. The world shrank to the small, warm circle of firelight inside the nearly completed cabin. The new wall held, a solid barrier against the storm's fury. They had a small stock of firewood inside, enough for a few days, but their main supply of dried meat, flour, and other winter provisions was in the small, sturdy shed Jonah had built a dozen paces from the cabin. They were sealed in, the storm, their jailer. Tatanka had taken shelter in a small, hidden cave on the ridge, a place he had prepared for just such an occasion. They were alone. Eliza sat by the fire, the wooden ring on her finger, a constant, smooth presence. She watched Jonah oiling his rifle, his face grim and thoughtful in the flickering light. The muffled silence of the snow was a strange comfort to her, a world without the jarring, half-heard sounds that so often disoriented her. But it was also unnerving. It was a silence that could hide anything. A sudden, sharp crack from outside broke the quiet rhythm of the storm. It was not the sound of a falling branch. It was the sound of a heavy boot snapping a frozen twig. Jonah froze, his head lifting, his eyes instantly alert. He looked at Eliza and saw that she had felt it too, a subtle vibration through the floorboards. He put a finger to his lips, though he knew she could not hear him. He moved silently to the small window, a piece of greased parchment, and peered through a tiny slit. He saw nothing but the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, but he knew they were out there. The storm had given them the perfect cover. He moved back to Eliza, his face a hard mask. He pointed to the new wall, to the small gap between the last log and the roof, a space he had not yet had time to chink. He motioned for her to hide there, in the narrow space between the new wall and an old stack of cured furs. He doused the main fire, leaving only the embers to cast a faint, ghostly glow. He took up his position by the door, his rifle ready. Eliza squeezed into the hiding place, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could see a sliver of the room through a gap in the furs. It was a world of deep shadows and faint red light. She could hear nothing but the howl of the wind and the pounding of her own blood. Then, a voice cut through the wind, rough and confident. "Pike! We know you are in there. The sheriff just wants to talk." Another voice, crueler, laughed. "He has that little deaf bride of his in there, too. Maybe she cannot hear us, but she will feel it when we burn this shack to the ground." The voices were distorted, muffled by the wind and the thick log walls. Eliza could not make out the words, but she felt the vibrations, the aggressive, hateful energy of them. She began to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that came from the very core of her. It was the same helpless terror she had felt in the wagon, the feeling of being an animal caught in a trap. Jonah saw her, from his position by the door. He could see her small form shaking in the darkness. He knew that any sound could betray them. He moved with a speed and silence that was unnerving, a large shadow detaching itself from the wall. He knelt before her hiding place, putting himself directly in her line of sight. The men outside shouted again, their words lost to the storm. Eliza flinched, a small, terrified sound catching in her throat. Jonah reached through the gap, his hand not touching her, but hovering close. He needed to calm her. He needed to anchor her. He leaned in so close that his face was only inches from hers, so close that she could see the slow, deliberate movement of his lips even in the deep gloom. He formed the words with an almost painful clarity, a breath of sound so quiet it was more a feeling than a noise, a secret meant only for the space between them. "My wife." As he spoke the words, his other hand, the one in her line of sight, made a slow, calming gesture, a hand moving down, a silent command, "Be still, be safe." Eliza's world stopped. The two words, spoken into the heart of the terrifying darkness, struck her with the force of a physical blow. She understood both meanings at once. It was a performance for the monsters outside, a role they were playing, but it was also the truth. In the dusty chapel, he had made a pact of alliance. Here, in the heart of the storm, surrounded by enemies, he was making a vow. He was not naming her as property. He was naming her his own. The shaking stopped. A profound, impossible calm settled over her. She was not an animal in a trap. She was here, with him. She was his wife. Suddenly, a sound tore through the night, a sound that was not human and not the storm. It was the long, chilling howl of a wolf, answered by another, and then another. The sound rose and fell, a wild, predatory chorus that seemed to come from all directions at once. Tatanka. The men outside fell silent. Then there were shouts of alarm, confusion. A shot rang out, then another. The wolf pack was a far more immediate and terrifying threat than a man barricaded in a cabin. The men's attention was diverted. This was the chance Jonah needed. The back door, a smaller, less obvious entrance, burst open, and a figure in a blue coat lunged in, his pistol drawn, his face a snarl of desperation to escape the chaos outside. He had not expected Jonah to be waiting. Jonah did not fire his rifle. He moved like a grizzly, with a speed that belied his size. He brought the heavy stock of his rifle around in a powerful arc, striking the man's gun hand. The pistol flew into the darkness, and the man screamed as the bones in his hand shattered. Before the man could recover, Jonah struck him again. A single, precise blow to the side of the head that sent him crumpling to the floor, unconscious but alive. The other men outside had had enough. They were firing blindly into the trees, their panic overriding their mission. A few moments later, there was the sound of horses galloping away, their hoofbeats quickly swallowed by the blizzard. The immediate danger had passed, but as Jonah barred the back door, a bright, hungry orange light began to flicker through the window. He looked out. His heart sank. The woodshed, they had set it on fire as they fled. He and Eliza could only watch from the cabin as the flames, fanned by the blizzard's winds, consumed the small building with terrifying speed. Their winter stores, the meat, the flour, the grains, everything they needed to survive the coming months, was turning to ash and smoke. The fire roared, a bright, defiant beast in the heart of the storm, before finally collapsing in on itself, leaving only a glowing black scar in the snow. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. They had survived the attack, but their enemies had still won. They had cut their lifeline. They could not hide in the hills and wait for spring. They would starve long before the snows melted. Tatanka appeared at dawn, a weary ghost emerging from the white world. The wolves were long gone, his allies in the wild. He looked at the smoking ruins of the shed, then at Jonah and Eliza. His face was grim. "There is no more waiting," he said. Jonah nodded, his gaze hard as granite. He looked at Eliza, and she met his eyes, her own resolve a perfect match for his. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. They could not defend. They had to attack. "Ashford is celebrating the completion of the new iron bridge in 3 nights, Tatanka said. "There will be another party. All the important men will be there. Maeve Kincaid will be there. And so will the master ledger," Jonah finished, his voice low and dangerous. Eliza looked from Jonah to Tatanka, then back again. She did not need to hear the words to understand. The time for hiding was over. The time for secrets and shadows was done. They would walk back into the heart of the town, into the center of the web. This time, they would not be stealing a single chapter. This time, they would take the whole story. The iron bridge was a black skeleton arching against a sky bruised with the last colors of sunset. It was a monument to steel, money, and the relentless will of Colonel Edwin Ashford. Lanterns hung from its girders, their light glinting on the cold, fast-moving river below and illuminating the grand pavilion set up at its entrance. The party was a bubble of warmth and noise in the vast, cold silence of the Dakota Territory. Music from a string quartet, imported for the occasion, spilled out, a thin, cultured sound that was utterly alien to the landscape. Eliza moved through the crowd, a ghost in a borrowed gown. The dress, a simple dark blue wool, had belonged to Rose, and it felt both strange and familiar, a quiet armor of solidarity. She kept her head down, her expression placid and vacant, the mask she had perfected over a lifetime. Inside, her senses were screaming. The vibrations from the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all of it beat against her. A chaotic tide. But tonight, the chaos was her shield. She was a servant girl, on loan from the saloon, a piece of the scenery, and utterly invisible. From her position near the grand staircase, she saw Jonah. He was dressed as a construction supervisor, a set of rolled blueprints tucked under his arm, a pencil behind his ear. He looked the part, his face serious, his gaze sweeping over the structural joints of the pavilion roof as if assessing their integrity. No one gave him a second glance. He was a piece of the machinery that had built this monument, a man of grit and labor, now observing the fruits of his work. High on the ridge overlooking the river, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the pines. Tatanka moved with a purpose that was as quiet and relentless as the river itself. He carried with him a coil of rope and a sharp knife. His objective was not the main bridge, a structure of permanent steel, but the temporary wooden trestle bridge 100 yards downstream, the one the bluecoats were using as a staging point and an easy escape route. Eliza made her way to the upper balcony, a tray of empty glasses her excuse. From here, she had a clear view of the entire party. She saw Ashford, resplendent in a tailored suit, accepting the congratulations of his investors. She saw Sheriff Cobb, his bulk squeezed into a uniform, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance. And she saw Maeve Kincaid, a queen in her own right, her silk dress shimmering in the lantern light. her expression a careful mixture of charm and calculation. Jonah moved to the base of the staircase, his back to the crowd. Pretending to inspect a support beam, Eliza leaned on the balcony railing, looking out over the crowd. She found Ashford's reflection in a large pane of glass. He was speaking to Maeve, his back to Eliza, but in the glass, his face was clear. "Maeve's private office," he said, his lips forming the words with precision. "The new contracts are in the wall safe behind the painting. I will bring the final signatures after the speech." Eliza's heart hammered. A second safe. The master ledger. She looked down at Jonah. He was looking up, not at her, but at the ceiling, his supervisor's gaze unwavering. She rested her right hand on the balcony rail, hidden from below. Jonah's eyes, without seeming to move, saw it. Her fingers began to move, a quick, silent dance. She signed the words into the air. Wall safe, behind painting, Maeve's office. Then she saw Maeve say something to a guard, who nodded and moved toward the saloon. The guard came back moments later and handed Maeve a small, ornate key. Maeve slipped it into a small purse that hung from her wrist. Eliza's fingers moved again, relaying the new information. Key, Maeve's purse. Jonah gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and sauntered away, melting back into the crowd. The first part of their mission was complete. Now, the waiting began. The climax of the evening was Ashford's speech. He stood on a small, decorated stage, the iron bridge a dramatic backdrop behind him. He spoke of progress, of taming the wilderness, of a new era of prosperity. As he spoke, Jonah slipped away from the party, moving with quiet purpose toward the back of the saloon. At the same moment, Eliza saw Maeve Kincaid excuse herself, heading in the same direction, likely to her office. This was the moment. Eliza followed. She moved through the now empty corridors of the saloon's upper floor, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She reached the office just as Maeve was closing the door. Eliza flattened herself into a small alcove across the hall, her heart a frantic, silent drum. Inside the office, Maeve did not go to the safe. Instead, she sat at her desk and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. It was a letter. From her hidden vantage point, Jonah, who had entered through the window, watched from behind a heavy curtain. He saw Maeve begin to write, her hand shaking slightly. "My dearest Maeve," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you have chosen to live." He could see that it was a letter to herself, a confession and a plea, a thing written by a woman trapped in a life she had come to despise. He heard a soft sound in the hallway and saw Eliza press herself into the alcove. The time was now. He had to get the key. At the same moment, Tatanka, having reached the temporary bridge, began his work. He sawed methodically through the thick support ropes on the far side, leaving the bridge standing but fatally weakened, ready to collapse with the slightest push. His work was a quiet prayer for justice, an act of unmaking to prevent a greater violence. The confrontation, when it came, happened on 3 fronts at once. In the office, Maeve looked up from her letter, her eyes full of a terrible sadness, and she saw Eliza, standing in the doorway. The girl had not made a sound, but Maeve had felt her presence. A sudden chill in the air. Maeve's hand instinctively went to the small pistol she kept in her desk drawer. "Do not," Eliza signed, her hands moving with a fluid, desperate grace. She took a step into the room. She pointed at Maeve, then made the sign for a girl, then the sign for lost. "You were one of them once." The words, silent as they were, struck Maeve with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from her face. She saw not the deaf girl she had bought, but a specter from her own past, a mirror reflecting a truth she had buried for years. Yes, her eyes seemed to say, She had been sold to a man in a dusty mining camp. Her own debt paid in flesh. She had survived by becoming the predator, by perpetuating the very system that had nearly destroyed her. Her hand fell away from the pistol. The fight went out of her. Outside, In the alley beneath the office window, Sheriff Cobb found Jonah climbing out, the master ledger now tucked in his coat. Cobb had been making his rounds, a sixth sense for the trouble telling him something was wrong. He drew his sidearm, a stubby, ugly weapon. "It is over. Pike!" Cobb snarled, his face a mask of sweat and fury. "You and that little witch are going to hang." Jonah did not draw a weapon. He held up his hands, the ledger a bulky shape under his coat. He took a step back, toward the high steel-barred window of the saloon's pantry. Cobb advanced, his gun steady. Jonah suddenly dropped, rolling, and came up with his carving knife in his hand. Cobb fired, the shot gouging a chunk of wood from the wall next to Jonah's head. Jonah did not charge. He lunged for the iron bars of the window, using them to launch himself sideways. As Cobb turned to fire again, Jonah's hand, holding the knife by the blade, shot out, and the heavy wooden handle of the carving tool struck Cobb's wrist with a sickening crack. The gun flew from Cobb's numb fingers, spun through the air, and landed with a quiet splash in the dark, swirling water of the river. Cobb stared at his empty hand, then at Jonah, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. He turned and ran, a lumbering, wounded animal disappearing into the darkness. On the bridge, the final act played out. Ashford, his speech concluded, was taking a solitary stroll across his new monument, a cigar glowing in the dark. Tatanka stepped out from behind a massive iron girder, blocking his path. "This land does not belong to you," Tatanka said, his voice calm and even. "You build your fortune on the graves of my people." Ashford's charming facade vanished, replaced by a raw, ugly snarl. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, silver derringer. "Get out of my way, you savage!" He fired. The shot was a small, sharp pop in the vast night. Tatanka moved with a liquid grace, the bullet passing through the space where he had been a second before Ashford could fire the second barrel. Tatanka closed the distance. He did not strike him with his fist. He used Ashford's own momentum, a subtle shift of his body, a trip of the foot, sending the colonel crashing to the hard iron decking. The derringer skittered away into the darkness. Tatanka was on him in an instant, not with a knife, but with a rope. He bound Ashford's hands and feet with swift, efficient knots, leaving him trussed and helpless on the cold steel of his own monument. Tatanka looked down at the sputtering, furious man. "My people do not kill for vengeance," he said. "We bind for justice." Back in the office, Maeve made her choice. She pushed the master ledger across the desk toward Eliza. Then she opened a drawer and took out the half-finished letter. She handed that over as well. She pointed to a line in the ledger, a name, Judge Miller, the district judge. Beside his name were a series of dates and payments. The law itself was for sale. "If I testify," she said, her voice a raw whisper, "you have to promise me you will protect the other girls. Get them away from here." Eliza looked at the woman, at the ruins of a life, and saw not an enemy, but another victim. She gave a single, solemn nod. The party dissolved into chaos. The news of Ashford's capture, of Cobb's flight, spread like wildfire. But as the Bluecoats tried to mount a rescue, a group of them driving a wagon onto the temporary bridge, Tatanka, from his perch on the ridge, gave the weakened structure a final, powerful shove with a long pole. With a great groan of protesting timber, the trestle bridge collapsed, plunging the wagon and its occupants into the cold river, effectively stranding the rest of their forces. A crowd began to gather at the entrance to the saloon, drawn by the rumors, their fear warring with their curiosity. Then, the doors opened. Eliza stepped out into the lantern light. She was not alone. Behind her stood Maeve Kincaid, and behind Maeve, a small, hesitant group of women began to emerge from the shadows. Rose, the waitress, Ludi Graves, the nurse, Sarah and Emily, the two girls they had rescued from the mine. One by one, they came forward, their faces pale but resolute. They had been silent for too long. Tonight, they had found their voice, and their translator stood before them. A quiet girl in a borrowed blue dress, holding a book full of terrible truths, ready to read them to the world. The law, when it finally arrived, did not come in a grand courthouse, but in the cavernous, dusty shell of the town's grain warehouse. The circuit judge, a man named Silas Miller, was a thin, bird-like man from the east, his black coat already powdered with a fine layer of flour dust. He stood behind a makeshift bench constructed from stacked grain sacks, looking out at the assembled crowd with an expression of weary duty. This was not a courtroom. It was a tinderbox. The air was thick with the scent of dry grain, old wood, and a tension so palpable it felt like another layer of dust. On one side of the central aisle sat Colonel Ashford, shackled between two grim-faced men who had ridden in with the judge. His expensive suit was rumpled, but his face was a mask of arrogant indignation. On the other side sat the witness's Maeve Kincaid, her face pale and stripped of its usual artifice. Rose, twisting a handkerchief in her chapped hands. Ludy Graves, her posture as rigid as a yucca's spine, and the girls, Sarah and Emily, huddled together for warmth and courage. Jonah stood near them, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man. Tatanka was not present in the room, a fact that made Jonah both uneasy and confident. Tatanka was not a man for rooms and laws written on paper. He was outside, a guardian watching the horizon. And at the center of it all stood Eliza. A small chalkboard on an easel had been found, and she stood beside it, a piece of chalk in her hand. She was the bridge, the conduit through which the silent stories would finally be given voice. Judge Miller banged a small gavel on the sacks, the sound a dull, unsatisfying thud in the vast space. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice thin against the silence. "We will begin with the testimony of—" He was cut off by a low, mournful sound from outside. It was the wind, but it was changing, its voice taking on a harder, angrier edge. The sunlight filtering through the high, dirty windows of the warehouse dimmed, turning a sickly yellow. A fine grit began to sift through the cracks in the walls, a taste of the plains themselves entering the room. The first witness, Rose, was called. She walked to the front, her steps hesitant. She spoke in a low, trembling voice, recounting the girls she had seen come and go, the whispers she had overheard. As she spoke, the wind rose to a shriek. The entire building groaned, and the tin roof began to rattle, a sound like 1,000 angry drumming fingers. The noise was a physical assault on Eliza. The vibrations shuddered up through the floor, a disorienting, chaotic roar that scrambled her senses. She tried to watch Rose's lips, but the air was growing thick with a swirling haze of dust. The dimming light made it impossible to see clearly. She felt a wave of panic, the old, familiar helplessness. How could she be their voice when she could not see, could not hear? Jonah saw her distress. He moved to her side and laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. He did not speak, but his touch was a language in itself. It said, "You are not alone. I am here." Eliza took a deep, shuddering breath. She closed her eyes for a second, shutting out the swirling chaos. Old Bear's words came back to her. Hear with the eyes, speak with the hands, live with the heart. Her eyes were failing her, but her hands were not. She picked up the chalk. When Rose faltered, unable to speak a particularly brutal detail, Eliza looked at her, her gaze full of a quiet, powerful empathy. Rose met her eyes, and a silent understanding passed between them. Rose made a few simple gestures. A girl, money changing hands, a pointing finger toward the new railroad barracks. Eliza turned to the board, and the chalk flew, her hands speaking a language everyone could read. Her letters were clear, precise, and damning. Sold for $40, sent to the railroad camp. One by one, they came forward, and the storm raged. Ludy Graves testified to the injuries she had treated, the fear she had seen. Sarah and Emily, their voices barely whispers, told of the mine, of the night train, and with each testimony, Eliza translated their broken words, their silent gestures, their palpable fear into undeniable, black and white truth on the chalkboard. She was no longer just a translator. She was a scribe, a witness, an accuser. The dust was a thick fog now, forcing the judge to light the lanterns. The world had shrunk to a small, hellish circle of yellow light, a pocket of fragile order against a world of roaring chaos. It was in that moment of peak fury, when the wind threatened to tear the roof from its moorings, that the great warehouse doors burst open. Sheriff Cobb stood there, a silhouette against the swirling brown apocalypse. He was no longer a man of the law. He was a renegade, his face a mask of mud and raw fury. Behind him stood a dozen men, a rough collection of bluecoats and hired guns, their faces covered with bandanas, their pistols drawn. "This proceeding is over," Cobb bellowed, his voice tearing through the storm. Panic erupted. The judge scrambled back from his bench of sacks. The witnesses huddled together, a small island of terror. But before Cobb's men could take more than 2 steps into the room, they stopped. From the shadows along the walls, from behind stacks of grain sacks, figures began to rise. They were the town's silent majority: the blacksmith, holding a heavy hammer; the stable owner, with a pitchfork; a dozen ranchers and miners, their faces grim, their hands holding rifles, not pointed, but held at a ready that was more menacing than any open threat. And at their head, stepping out from behind the main support pillar, was Tatanka. He held no weapon. He simply stood there, his presence an embodiment of unshakable resolve. He had not fought Cobb's men with violence. He had met them with community. He had shown them that the town was no longer theirs to bully. The gunmen looked from the silent, determined faces of their neighbors to their furious leader, and their resolve wavered. They were hired for money, not to die in a dusty warehouse. One by one, they lowered their guns. The standoff was over before a shot was fired. Cobb stared, his face a picture of disbelief, his authority broken, his power revealed as the hollow thing it had always been. Jonah chose that moment to step forward. He walked past the disarmed gunmen, past the silent wall of townsfolk, and stood before the judge's bench. He laid the master ledger on the sacks. The sound was a solid, final thud. "This is Maeve Kincaid's master ledger," he said, his voice cutting through the dying howl of the wind. "It lists every girl, every transaction, and every bribe." He then placed Maeve's unfinished letter beside it. "This is her confession." Finally, he unrolled the surveyor's map he had taken from the saloon. "And this is the map of the night train, the one that carried 6 girls into Stone Pass. The girls Colonel Ashford and Sheriff Cobb arranged to be delivered." All eyes turned to Maeve Kincaid. She looked small and broken in the lantern light. She took a hesitant step forward, her body trembling. Judge Miller looked down at her. "Is this true, madam?" Maeve looked at the girls she had wronged, at the ledger that held the record of her sins, at the man she had served. And then she looked at Eliza, who stood by the chalkboard, her face not full of judgment, but of a quiet, sorrowful understanding. A great, ragged sob broke from Maeve's chest. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible, then louder, her voice thick with tears. "Yes, it is all true. I took the girls. I took the money. I did it all. But he made me, Ashford. He made the whole system. He owns the contracts. He owns the sheriff. He even owns you. Judge Miller, your name is in that book." She collapsed into a heap, her sobs echoing in the now quiet warehouse. The storm outside had begun to recede, its fury spent. Judge Miller, his face pale as chalk, stared at the ledger, at his own name, a damning indictment. He knew, in that moment, that his own career was in jeopardy, but he also knew he was standing on a precipice. The law had been broken, but something more powerful had asserted itself. The will of a community to cleanse itself. He banged his gavel, the sound sharp and clear in the sudden stillness. "Colonel Edwin Ashford, you are to be held in federal custody pending a full investigation." He pointed a trembling finger at Cobb. "Sheriff Cobb, you are stripped of your office and placed under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and kidnapping. A warrant is to be issued for the immediate arrest of every man on Ashford's payroll." It was over. The corrupt machine had been broken. As men moved to cuff the sputtering Ashford and the defeated Cobb, the great doors of the warehouse creaked open. The dust storm had passed. The air outside was washed clean, the late afternoon sun breaking through the clouds, casting long, peaceful shadows. Eliza walked out onto the loading dock and took a deep breath. The air was cool and clean, tasting of rain and wet earth. A gentle breeze stirred, whispering through the eaves of the warehouse. For the first time in her memory, she heard the sound of the wind not as a threat, not as a confusing, muffled roar, but simply as a sound. It was the sound of a world that was quiet, a world that was, at long last, at peace. The seasons turned, and the raw scars on the land and in the people's hearts began to heal. The iron bridge stood, but it no longer felt like a monument to one man's greed. Instead, it was just a bridge, a thing of steel and rivets that carried freight and folk from one place to another. The railroad, under new and chastened management, sent surveyors to speak with Tatanka and the Lakota elders. A new path was drawn on the maps, one that respected the sacred grounds and the old ways. Justice, it turned out, was not always a verdict hammered down in a courtroom. Sometimes it was a line redrawn in the dirt, a quiet act of listening. The town began to find its new shape. The bluecoats were gone, scattered to the winds, replaced by a new sheriff, a quiet, steady man who had been one of the ranchers in the warehouse that day, Maeve Kincaid, given a lenient sentence in exchange for her full testimony, left the territory. Her letter to herself the only possession she took with her. The saloon was now just a saloon, a place for a quiet drink, its shadows no longer seeming so deep or menacing. Rose took it over, and with Ludi Graves's help, it became a respectable boarding house for women traveling alone. Eliza did not leave. The world had opened up to her, offering 1,000 different paths. But the one she chose was the one that led back up the winding trail to the pine cabin in the hills. The red dust of the settlement did not cling to her spirit anymore. She had found her ground. She did not need the world's noise. She began to learn the language of wood. Jonah taught her, his large hands guiding hers as she held the carving knife, showing her how to read the grain, how to feel the life still in the timber. Her hands, which had for so long been her only voice, found a new way to speak, shaping bowls from birch and spoons from ash. There was a peace in the work, a satisfaction in creating something solid and useful from the raw material of the forest. But she was not content to simply build things. She had a purpose that went beyond the confines of the cabin. She had seen the loneliness and isolation in the eyes of the other women, in the children who had no one to teach them. In a corner of the now completed cabin, she set up a small school. It started with Sarah and Emily, the 2 girls she had helped rescue. She taught them the hand signs, the language of silence that had saved her, and they, in turn, helped her with her own reading and writing. Soon, a young boy from the town, an orphan named Noah, who worked at the post office and loved books more than anything, began to make the trek up the hill twice a week. He helped teach the letters, his young, clear voice reading stories aloud, while Eliza sat beside him, her hands dancing as she translated the words into a beautiful, silent poetry for those who could not hear. It was a small corner of the world, a place of quiet learning, a testament to the fact that a voice did not need to be loud to be heard. One afternoon, as the first snows of the next winter began to fall, Jonah fitted the final log into place on the 4th wall of the cabin. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked at the finished structure. It was solid, true, and built to withstand any storm. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him, a small, proud smile on her face. "This is your home," he said, his lips forming the words with a slow, deliberate care. A house does not need a lock to be strong, and this one will never lock your freedom. Tatanka came to visit a few weeks later, before the snows grew too deep. He did not come as a scout or a warrior, but as a friend. He brought a gift of smoked salmon and news that the treaty for the new rail line had been signed. He would be a guide for the surveyors in the spring. He looked around the finished cabin, at the small school in the corner, at the quiet, comfortable peace that filled the space. He looked at Jonah and Eliza, and he saw not two separate people, but two halves of a whole, a unit as strong and natural as the pines that sheltered them. "I will return when the snows melt," he said as he left. "You are my family now." That night, a deep and profound silence settled over the hills. The snow fell in thick, gentle flakes, erasing the world, leaving only the warm, golden light of the cabin window, a single point of reference in the vast, white darkness. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing on the new log walls. Eliza sat on the hearthstone, watching the flames, the wooden ring on her finger glowing in the warm light. Jonah came and sat beside her. He did not speak for a long time. He simply shared the quiet, the warmth. Then he reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing the smooth, worn surface of the pine ring. He leaned in close, so she could see his face, his eyes. That day in the chapel, he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, "I spoke the words to keep you safe, to fool the world." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "That night in the storm, I spoke a word to give you courage, to hold back the darkness." His thumb stroked the ring, a slow, circular motion, like the grain of the wood itself. "Tonight," he said, his voice full of a quiet, humble truth, "there are no enemies to fool. There is no darkness to fight. There is only this, only us. Tonight, if you wish it, I will speak it for the truth of what we have built." Eliza looked into his eyes, and she saw his whole heart there, a thing as solid and true as the cabin he had built around them. She saw the ghosts of his past, the healed scars of his solitude, and the quiet, steady strength of his love. A slow, beautiful smile bloomed on her face. She did not need to speak. She simply nodded, "Yes." Then she raised her hands, her movements graceful and sure in the firelight. She made the sign for freedom, and then the sign for together, their first vow, the truest one, now remade not for survival, but for joy. He did not kiss her. He simply put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat there for a long time, two people in a small cabin, watching the fire burn brightly against the long winter night. A small, warm light that had, against all odds, defeated a very great darkness. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. We would love to see where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be shared with more people.